Theme Summary. We have spent the last 3 weeks exploring the question, what do we know about how students learn? We've learned that learning is generally defined as relatively permanent changes in behavior, skills, knowledge, or attitudes resulting from identifiable psychological or social experiences. We've learned that the behavioral perspective views learning as changes in observable behavior, and we've explored the theories of classical and operant conditioning. We've also learned that the cognitive perspective views learning as changes in thinking which may lead to changes in behavior, and we've explored information processing theory, psychological and social constructivism. Finally, we learned that social cognitive theory is a third perspective that blends the behavioral and cognitive views of learning. Now let's see how each theory would interpret a learning experience. When he was young, John reached up to touch a hot stove and burned his hand. He never touched the hot stove again. Obviously, this would qualify as learning, since there has been a relatively permanent change in John's behavior as the result of an experience. But how would each learning theory explain how this learning occurred? I encourage you to pause this video and to work this out for yourself before continuing. Pavlov would likely say that the natural response to something causing us pain is to withdraw. The hot stove, a previously neutral stimulus, has become associated with pain and therefore John avoids hot stoves. Skinner would disagree, asserting that the behavior of touching the hot stove was followed by an unpleasant consequence, which resulted in a decrease in the frequency of the behavior. Information processing theorists would claim that clearly John paid attention to the sensory input on his hand. He added this information to his stove schema and encoded it into his long-term memory. Subsequently, when seeing a hot stove, he was able to retrieve or remember this information and avoid touching hot stoves. Piaget would argue that John's natural curiosity led to his experimentation with the hot stove. Since John's existing schema did not help him understand the experience, he would have been in a mental state of disequilibrium. Therefore, John would need to reorganize his existing schema or create a new schema, a process known as accommodation. In the future, he would be able to use this schema to understand what would happen if he touched another hot stove. As described, this learning experience would be difficult to interpret using social constructivism since John was alone. However, we can assume that there would have been some interaction with an adult following this incident, and likely the adult would explain that this is why hot stoves shouldn't be touched. Vygotsky would assert that in the future, John would use self-talk and then inner speech to guide his behavior around hot stoves. First between, then within. Bandura's social cognitive theory does not explain this learning experience as John learned firsthand, rather than by observing others. If there was a younger child in the room, and that child never touched a hot stove, Bandura would say it was because they had observed what happened to John, and experienced vicarious punishment. Each of these learning theories provides a reasonable explanation of how John learned not to touch a hot stove. So which one is the best learning theory?